market was dark and noisy and full of strange smells and alien sounds, and people from many different planets were shouting and trading and laughing and moving quickly. And in the middle of all this chaos, a small cage was hanging from a rusty pole, and inside it a young alien girl was chained, and she looked weak and scared, and her eyes were wide and full of tears. And she was crying for help, and no one cared, and many people just walked past her or laughed at her pain. And some guards were watching her and talking about selling her for a high price, and she could barely move because the chains were heavy and dug into her arms and legs, and every shout and every laugh made her feel more trapped, and she whispered, "Please, someone, help me," over and over. But no one listened, and her voice was tiny against the loud market noise, and the smells of strange foods and chemicals made her feel dizzy, and she shivered because the night was cold, and the wind blew dust into her eyes and made her cough. And even though she was small and alone, she tried to keep her hope alive, and she looked at every person passing by with pleading eyes. But they all looked away, and she wondered why no one wanted to help her, and she thought maybe no one could see her, or maybe she was not important. And then she saw him, a human man, walking slowly and looking around as if he was lost, and he was taller than everyone else, and his face was serious, and he noticed her almost immediately, and he stopped in his tracks and stared for a moment, and his heart started beating fast because there was something in her eyes that touched him deeply, and he could feel her fear and her pain, and he could not ignore it even though he did not know her, and he had never been in a place like this before, and he did not know what kind of dangers were around, but he felt that he had to do something, and he hid behind a pillar and watched the guards and the people trading and laughing, and he could see how cruelly they were treating her. And he could feel anger and fear mixing inside him, and he thought maybe he should call for help, or maybe he should leave, but every second he looked at her, he felt more certain that he could not just walk away, and he took a deep breath and stepped a little closer slowly so that no one noticed him. And she saw him move, and her eyes widened, and she whispered again, "Please help me." And he nodded slightly to let her know he saw her and understood her, and a small spark of hope appeared in her heart. And the human looked around quickly to see if any guard was watching, and he could feel the tension in the air like electricity, and his hands were slightly shaking because he did not know what to do yet, and he could not speak out loud because the market was too crowded and the people were too close, and he had to be careful, and he moved even closer, and his eyes never left her, and he noticed a weak spot in the chains that could be broken if he tried carefully, and the girl whispered something with her lips moving slowly, and he understood that she was telling him where the chain was loose, and he nodded again, and he felt a strange connection with her, as if they had known each other in another time or place, and he could feel her fear and trust mixing together, and he knew this was the only chance to help her, and he had to act now before someone else noticed them, and the lights of the market flickered, and shadows moved across the walls, and he could see the other cages filled with creatures, but none of them had eyes that looked at him like hers. And he took a step closer and whispered in his mind, "Do not worry, I will help you." And she smiled a little, even though tears were still in her eyes, and for the first time she felt that maybe someone would really help her, and the human moved closer, still trying to stay unseen, and the guards were talking loudly and laughing and trading goods, and he could hear the girls' small sobs mixed with the noises of the market, and he felt a rush of courage and fear, and he thought to himself, "I cannot leave her here alone." And he carefully touched the chain and felt how rusted it was, and he knew if he tried at the right moment, it could break, and she looked at him with hope shining in her eyes, and he whispered silently, "Just wait for me, I will save you." The night was darker now, and the market was quieter, but still full of shadows and strange noises, and the human moved carefully between crates and pillars, and the girl in the cage watched him with wide eyes full of hope and fear, and her chains rattled softly whenever she shifted, and he could hear them and feel the weight of what he was about to do. And every step he took was risky because guards could turn at any moment and see him, and the glow from the lamps above flickered and made long shadows across the ground, and he crouched behind a stack of crates and watched the cage closely, and he could see how fragile she looked and how desperate she was to be free, and he whispered in his mind, "Do not worry, I am here." And the girl tilted her head and watched him with trust, and a tiny spark of courage in her heart, and he noticed the lock on the cage and how it was old and rusted, and he could almost see it giving way if he tried carefully, and the wind blew through the alleys carrying the smell of alien foods and smoke, and it made him cough. But he did not stop moving, and he inched closer, step by step keeping low and silent, and every sound of a footstep or a guard's shout made his heart beat faster, and he could feel the girl trembling inside the cage, and he felt a surge of determination because she was counting on him, and he checked. The path behind him and in front of him in the market had strange corners and narrow passages, and he had to be careful not to get trapped, and he could hear distant voices shouting and the clatter of goods being moved, and he could see other cages, with creatures staring silently at him, but none of them had eyes like hers that seemed to beg for help. And he whispered silently just a little more, and the girl leaned slightly toward him and nodded because she understood he was trying to help her, and he could see the weak links in her chains, and he knew if he pushed carefully he could break them without making a loud noise, and he took a deep breath and focused on the lock, and he moved his hands slowly over the metal, feeling the rust and the cracks and the weak spots, and he imagined the moment she would be free. And the guards were chatting and laughing a few meters away, and he counted every second, and he felt sweat on his forehead, but he kept moving, and he whispered silently, "Stay calm." And she leaned back slightly and whispered a soft thank you without sound. But he felt it in his heart, and he bent down closer, and his fingers found the right spot on the chain, and he applied pressure slowly and carefully, and the metal bent just a little, and he could feel it giving way, and a loud noise could happen if he was wrong, and his chest was tight, and he could hear the girl's small breathing, and he whispered silently, "Almost there," and she moved her hands to help him, and he felt a strange warmth as if she was giving him strength, and the steps of a guard came from behind a crate. And he froze, and the girl froze too, and they both held their breath, and he felt the tension like a knife pressing into his chest, and the guard moved away, and they both exhaled slowly, and he went back to the chain and pressed again carefully, and it cracked slightly, and he whispered silently now. And she nodded slightly, and he bent further, and the chain started to break slowly. And the girl tried to lift herself, but her strength was weak, and he put his hand under her and guided her carefully so she would not fall, and the chain finally broke with a soft snap, and she was free but still crouched and trembling. And he whispered, "Quietly, do not move, we are not safe yet." And she looked at him with tears and gratitude, and he felt a strange connection, like they were meant to meet. And suddenly a loud shout echoed from the far side of the market, and footsteps ran toward them. And he grabbed her hand and pulled her behind a stack of crates, and they pressed themselves against the shadows, and he whispered silently, "We have to move quickly." And she nodded with fear and hope mixed together, and together they planned their next move through the dark alleys toward safety, and he could feel every heartbeat and every sound, and knew this night would change both of their lives forever. The market was alive with echoes of distant shouts, and the human and the alien girl moved carefully through narrow alleys, and broken crates and strange glowing signs flickered above and painted their faces with orange and blue light, and every step was dangerous because guards and hunters could appear at any moment. And the girl clung to his hand, and he felt her fear mixing with his own, but he could not let her go because she was fragile and alone, and the chains were still cold in his memory, and he whispered silently, "Keep close to me," and she nodded quickly, and they slipped through a side passage where shadows hid them from view, and the smell of alien spices and burning oils was strong, and it made them dizzy and cough, and he could hear the clattering of metal and distant voices calling out, and he knew they had to move fast before someone noticed the broken cage and the missing girl, and they turned a corner and ran past a vendor selling strange glowing fruits, and a small creature hissed at them, and they jumped over crates and barrels, and their hearts were pounding like drums in the quiet night, and the girl whispered, "Please do not let them catch me." And he squeezed her hand and whispered silently, "I will not let them touch you." And they moved faster, and the narrow alley opened to a wider street where strange vehicles hovered and zoomed past, and the neon lights reflected on the wet ground. And they ran across the street and ducked behind a stack of boxes, just as a guard shouted something and pointed in their direction, and they froze and held their breath, and the guard looked confused and moved on. And they exhaled slowly and continued running, and the girl stumbled on a loose stone. And he caught her quickly and whispered silently, "Stay with me," and she nodded, and they ran past another cage where a small alien child was crying. But they could not stop, and he felt a pang of guilt and hope mixed together, and they turned down another alley, where shadows were deep and the walls were covered with strange markings and glowing symbols, and he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, because the girl was counting on him to keep her safe. And suddenly a loud bang echoed, and footsteps approached fast, and he grabbed the girl and ducked into a small doorway that led to a half-ruined building, and they pressed themselves against the wall and listened to the guards running past, shouting and swearing, and the girl was trembling, and he whispered silently, "You are safe for now." And she leaned slightly against him and whispered, "Thank you," in her strange language, and he nodded and could feel the warmth of trust and connection growing between them. And he looked around the building and saw broken furniture and old crates and a small hole in the wall that led to the outside streets, and he whispered silently, "We have to move again." And the girl nodded quickly, and they climbed through the hole, carefully avoiding the broken metal and sharp edges. And once outside, they ran across a quiet street where only the distant hum of hovering vehicles could be heard. And the girl stumbled again, and he caught her and whispered silently, "Almost there." And she looked at him with wide eyes, full of fear and hope, and they turned another corner and saw a faint light in the distance, and it looked like a safe place for now. And he guided her toward it slowly and carefully, watching every shadow and every movement. And suddenly, a guard appeared at the end of the street and shouted and pointed, and they froze, and the girl looked at him terrified, and he grabbed her hand and ran toward the light with all his strength, and the guard fired a small stun device, but they dodged it and ran faster, and he could feel the girl's heartbeat matching his own. And they were almost there when a strange noise came from above, like something falling, and they ducked and pressed themselves against the wall, and the guard ran past without seeing them, and they exhaled and continued running toward the light, and finally they reached a small abandoned building that looked safe, and he helped the girl inside, and she collapsed on the floor, exhausted, but relieved, and he whispered silently, "We are safe for now, but we cannot stay here long." And she looked at him with wide eyes full of gratitude, and he knew this was only the beginning of a long night and a dangerous journey, but he was determined to protect her no matter what. And she held his hand tightly and whispered silently, "I trust you." The abandoned building smelled of dust and old wood, and the human helped the alien girl inside, and she sank to the floor, exhausted and trembling, and he looked around carefully and saw broken furniture and torn curtains and shadows that seemed to move as the light flickered from the hole in the roof, and he whispered silently, "Stay quiet for now." And she nodded slightly and hugged her knees to her chest, and he could see how small and fragile she looked, and her eyes were wide and scared but also curious, and he could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders because she trusted him completely. And he whispered silently, "Do not worry, I will protect you." And she looked at him with a mix of fear and hope, and the distant noises of the market were faint, but still audible. And he knew the hunters would be searching for her, and he needed a plan. And he moved quietly to the broken window and peered outside, and the street was empty, but the shadows were long and moving, and he could see the glow of the neon signs reflecting off wet puddles, and he whispered silently, "We cannot stay here long. They will come looking soon." And she shivered and whispered, "I do not want to go back," and he nodded and felt a strange connection to her because he did not want her to be hurt or trapped again. And he moved back to her and offered his hand, and she took it slowly, and he helped her to her feet, and she leaned on him slightly because she was still weak, and he guided her to a corner where crates and debris formed a small hidden space, and he whispered silently, "Sit here and stay hidden." And she nodded and hugged herself, and he looked around again and could feel the tension in the air because any sound could give them away. And he whispered silently, "Tell me your name." And she hesitated and whispered softly, but he leaned closer and listened carefully, and finally she said a name that sounded strange, but beautiful, and he nodded and repeated it silently to remember it, and she smiled slightly, even though tears were still in her eyes, and he felt a spark of relief, because now she trusted him enough to share her name. And he whispered silently, "I am not going to let anything happen to you." And she looked at him and nodded, and a strange glow started to appear faintly in her eyes like a light from deep inside, and he noticed it and wondered if it was part of her being or fear or something more powerful, and he kept his hand near her shoulder to reassure her, And she leaned on him slightly and whispered, "I have been trapped for so long." And he listened quietly and nodded, and felt her pain like a weight pressing into his chest. And he whispered silently, "I know, but you are safe now." And she looked at him with wide eyes full of hope, and he could feel the urgency, because night was not over, and the hunters would not stop easily. And he moved carefully to the entrance and peeked outside again and saw no one but shadows moved in the distance, and he whispered silently, "We need to find a better place soon, somewhere hidden and safe." And she nodded, and he noticed she was still weak and shivering. And he whispered silently, I will carry you if needed." And she looked at him with surprise but nodded because she trusted him. And he could feel her heartbeat matching his own as they planned their next move. And he whispered silently, "Tell me about where you came from." And she hesitated but slowly began to move her hands and make signs and small sounds that he tried to understand. And he realized she was telling him she was from a rare species that few humans had seen, and she had been captured for her uniqueness, and he felt anger and determination mixing together because she was innocent. And he whispered silently, "Do not worry, I will keep you safe." And she leaned on him and whispered softly, "I never thought anyone would care." And he smiled faintly and whispered, "Silently, you are not alone now." And the shadows outside shifted again, and he felt the tension rise because they had little time, and the night was full of danger. And yet in that abandoned building, he felt a strange calm, because for the first time, she was not chained, and he could see a small smile forming on her face, and he knew their journey was only beginning. But together they could face the darkness. The abandoned building was quiet now except for the distant hum of the city and the human, and the alien girl moved cautiously through the broken rooms and piles of debris, and he kept his hand near hers so she would not feel alone, and she followed him carefully, her small steps echoing softly on the cracked floor, and the shadows of the night danced across the walls, making the room look alive and dangerous, and he whispered silently, "Stay close to me." And she nodded and hugged herself tightly, because she was still weak and frightened, but the presence of the human gave her a strange sense of safety, and he noticed her trembling and moved closer and whispered silently, "Do not worry, I will keep you safe." And she looked at him with wide eyes full of hope and fear, and he could feel her heartbeat, and it was fast and irregular, and he knew they could not stay long in this place because the hunters would not stop looking. And he whispered silently, "We need a better hiding place somewhere. No one can find us." And she nodded and leaned on him slightly and whispered softly, "What if they come for me again?" And he shook his head gently and whispered silently, "I will not let that happen." And he guided her to a corner where crates and old furniture formed a small refuge, and she sat down carefully, and he crouched beside her and watched the broken windows in the dark alley outside, and he could feel the tension in the air like electricity. And he whispered silently, "Tell me about your home." And she hesitated and then moved her hands and made small gestures and sounds that he tried to understand, and slowly he realized she was describing a place full of light and trees and strange creatures, and a sky that changed colors constantly. And he listened carefully and nodded and whispered silently, "I will remember your home." And she smiled faintly even though tears were still in her eyes, and he could feel the connection growing stronger between them. And suddenly a noise came from outside, a crate falling, or a guard stepping on metal, and they both froze. And the girl's eyes widened, and he whispered silently, "Do not move," and pressed his hand gently over hers, and they both held their breath and waited for the sound to fade. And it did. And he exhaled slowly and whispered silently, "That was close. But we are okay for now." And she leaned on him slightly and whispered softly, "Thank you." And he nodded and felt a warmth in his chest because she trusted him completely. And he could see her small smile forming despite the fear. And he whispered silently, "We will find a safe place soon." And she nodded and moved slightly closer and whispered softly, "Will you really protect me?" And he looked into her eyes and nodded firmly, and whispered silently always. And she hugged her knees and leaned her head on his shoulder, and he could feel her small frame trembling. And he whispered silently, "It is okay. You are not alone." And she looked up at him with wide eyes, and a faint glow started in her skin like it was responding to his calm, and he noticed it and wondered if it was part of her species or something more magical. And he whispered silently, "That is beautiful. Do not be afraid." And she smiled faintly again, and the distant noises of the city reminded them that danger was still near. And he moved carefully to check the entrances and saw no one but shadows shifted in the corners, and he whispered silently, "We must move soon, but take a moment to rest." And she nodded, and leaned on him again and whispered softly, "I never thought anyone would care for me." And he smiled faintly and whispered silently, "You are not alone now." And they shared a quiet moment in the shadows, feeling the tension ease slightly, but knowing the night was far from over and every sound outside made them alert. And he could feel her small hand tightening around his, and he whispered silently, "We will get through this together." And she nodded, and a small smile formed on her face, and for the first time she felt hope and trust, and he knew that their bond was growing stronger, and that even in the darkness they could face what came next together, and the building felt less empty and dangerous, because for the first time she was not alone, and he was determined to protect her no matter what. And she looked at him with gratitude and whispered softly, "Thank you again." And he nodded silently and whispered silently, "Always." The night grew colder, and shadows deepened in the abandoned streets, and the human and the alien girl moved cautiously through narrow passages and broken alleys, and he kept his hand near hers so she would not feel alone, and she followed carefully, her small steps echoing softly on the cracked ground and the neon. Lights flickered from distant signs and painted the walls with blue and orange light, and every step was dangerous because hunters and guards could appear at any moment. And she clung to him tightly because she trusted him completely, and he could feel her fear mixing with hope, and he whispered silently, "Stay close to me," and she nodded, and a faint glow appeared in her eyes like a small spark from deep inside her. And he noticed it and felt a shiver run through his spine, and he wondered what it meant. And they turned a corner, and the sound of rushing footsteps echoed behind them, and he grabbed her hand and pulled her into a shadowed doorway and pressed himself against the wall, and they held their breath as the footsteps came closer, and a guard shouted and pointed in the wrong direction, and they froze and waited until the sound faded, and she whispered softly, "I thought they would catch me." And he shook his head gently and whispered silently, "Not while I am here." And they continued, moving slowly through the streets, avoiding open areas and ducking behind crates and broken vehicles, and he could feel her heartbeat matching his own. And the glow in her eyes pulsed slightly with every step, and he realized there was something powerful inside her that he could feel even without knowing its meaning. And they came to a wider street, and the neon signs reflected in the puddles on the wet ground, and he could see hunters moving in the distance searching for them. And he whispered, silently, "We have to run now." And she nodded, and they sprinted across the street and dodged a hovering vehicle, and he felt the wind push against them, and her small hand in his was strong and determined, and suddenly a trapdoor in the street opened, and a hunter appeared pointing a stun device, and they dodged it barely, and he grabbed her and pulled her through a narrow alley. And the walls were covered with glowing graffiti and strange symbols that seemed alive in the flickering light, and she looked at him with wide eyes full of fear and trust, and he whispered silently, "Almost there, keep running." And they turned another corner, and a loud noise came from above like something falling, and they ducked just in time to avoid it. And the glow in her eyes grew slightly brighter as if responding to the danger around them, and he realized she was not just frightened. She was aware of him and their surroundings in a way that was beyond normal, and they reached a half-ruined building, and he guided her inside, and she sank to the floor exhausted but alert, and he whispered silently, "Stay here. I will check outside." And she nodded, and the glow in her eyes dimmed slightly, but she remained aware, and he moved carefully to a broken window and looked outside and saw hunters searching with bright lights and strange devices, and he could feel his heart pounding and knew they had little time. And he whispered silently, "We must find another exit fast," and turned back to her, and she looked at him and whispered softly, "Can you really protect me?" And he smiled faintly and whispered silently, "Always." and she hugged her knees and leaned against the wall, and he could see a small smile forming on her face, even though fear was still there, and the glow in her eyes pulsed again like a warning or a signal, and he felt a rush of determination because whatever powers she had, he would keep her safe, and they had to move soon through the shadows to survive the night, and the hunters would not stop, and he whispered silently, "We are stronger together." And she looked at him with trust and hope, and for the first time in a long time she felt that someone truly cared for her, and he knew their journey was only beginning, but together they could face anything that came next, and the night around them felt full of danger, but also full of possibility. The night was still dark, and the city streets were quiet but full of hidden dangers, and the human helped the alien girl stand and guided her carefully through the narrow alleys, and she clung to his hand tightly, because she trusted him completely, and he could feel her fear and hope mixing together. And he whispered silently, "Stay close to me." And she nodded, and the faint glow in her eyes pulsed gently like a heartbeat, and he realized she had a power inside her that was not fully understood, but it could sense danger and help them survive. And they moved carefully past broken vehicles and abandoned stalls, and the wind carried strange smells of alien spices and burning oils, and every shadow seemed alive, and he could hear distant footsteps and shouts from hunters searching for them. And he whispered silently, "Almost there. Keep moving." And she followed him closely, her small steps echoing softly on the cracked ground, and they came to a half-ruined building with a collapsed roof, and he knew it could be their last chance to hide or escape. And he guided her inside, and she sank to the floor exhausted, but alert. And he whispered silently, "Stay here. I will find a safe path." And she nodded and hugged her knees, and the glow in her eyes dimmed slightly, but remained like a small beacon of hope. And he moved carefully through the broken rooms and debris, and saw a small tunnel leading away from the city. And he whispered silently, "This is it, our way out." And he returned to her and helped her to her feet, and they crawled through the tunnel, slowly avoiding sharp metal and broken wood, and the walls were cold and damp, and the air smelled of earth and moss, and he could hear the distant hum of the city fading behind them. And she looked at him and whispered softly, "Are we really safe now?" And he shook his head gently and whispered silently, "Not yet, but we are closer than before," and the glow in her eyes pulsed brighter, as if responding to his calm and protective presence. And they continued through the tunnel, and the ground became uneven and slippery, and he held her hand tightly to prevent her from falling, and she leaned on him slightly and whispered, "I never thought anyone would care for me." And he smiled faintly and whispered silently, "You are not alone now." And they emerged from the tunnel into a forest of strange glowing trees and soft moss underfoot, and the light from the bioluminescent plants painted their faces with green and blue. And the night seemed less dangerous here, but still full of unknown creatures, and he guided her through the trees, carefully keeping low and silent, and she followed every step, trusting him completely, and the glow in her eyes pulsed gently in rhythm with her heartbeat. And he realized she was calming down and feeling safe for the first time in a long time. And they reached a small clearing with a faint stream, and he whispered silently, "Rest here for a moment," and she sank to the ground and drank water. And he watched her carefully, and the stars above shone brightly through the gaps in the trees, and she looked at him with wide eyes full of gratitude and whispered softly, "Thank you for saving me." And he smiled faintly and whispered silently, "Always." And they sat together quietly, listening to the night sounds, and he could feel her small hand in his, and the warmth and trust growing between them. And he whispered silently, "We are free for now, but the world outside is still dangerous." And she nodded and whispered softly, "I do not care as long as I am with you." And he smiled faintly, and knew that no matter what challenges came next, he would protect her and guide her through them, and together they could face any danger. And the glow in her eyes faded gently as she relaxed, and he felt a wave of relief and hope, and they sat in silence under the glowing trees, knowing the night was not over, but their bond was unbreakable, and the journey ahead was full of uncertainty and adventure. And he whispered silently, "We will face it together." And she smiled and whispered softly, "Together." And in that moment, the stars above seemed to shine brighter, and the forest around them seemed alive with possibilities, and the darkness of the city and the chains of the past felt far away. And for the first time she felt truly free and safe, and